You know how it feels like when your own family treats you like you're made of glass? When they look at you and see fragility instead of strength, limitation instead of possibility? 2 months ago, I discovered just how suffocating that protective cage can become. I had just turned 74 and was sitting in my living room in Cedar Falls, Iowa, scrolling through travel photos on my tablet when my daughter Sarah walked in with that concerned expression I'd grown to dread. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Margaret Holbrook, and for most of my adult life, I believed that being a good mother and grandmother meant accepting whatever limits my family placed on me out of love. Boy, was I wrong about that. Let me tell you about the family I raised and how they nearly convinced me that my adventurous spirit had an expiration date. Sarah is my eldest at 52, a successful insurance adjuster who inherited her father's practical nature and my stubborn streak. She lives just 15 minutes away with her husband, David, and they've made it their mission to keep me safe since my husband, Paul, passed 3 years ago. Then there's my son, Robert, 49, who moved to Chicago for his job in financial consulting, but calls every Sunday just to check on me like I'm a patient in a care facility, rather than his mother, who raised him to be independent and strong. Sarah's children, my grandchildren Emma and Lucas, are 23 and 21 respectively. They're good kids, but they've absorbed this family narrative that Grandma Margaret is someone who needs protecting, rather than someone who once backpacked through Europe in her 20s, who raised two children largely on her own while Paul traveled for work, and who managed our household finances so well that we retired comfortably at 65. After Paul died, something shifted in how my family saw me. The woman who had driven cross-country alone to visit relatives, who had navigated foreign cities with nothing but a guidebook and determination, who had managed every crisis our family faced with grace and resourcefulness, suddenly became someone too fragile to handle basic decisions about her own life. It started small, as these things always do. Sarah began insisting on doing my grocery shopping because the parking lot at the supermarket was too crowded and dangerous for someone my age. Robert started having my mail forwarded to his address in Chicago so he could review my financial statements and make sure I wasn't being scammed by telemarketers. Emma would drop by unannounced to check that I was eating properly and taking my medications on schedule. At first, I appreciated their concern. Grief makes you vulnerable, and having family who cares enough to worry about your well-being is a blessing many people don't have. But gradually, their protection began to feel more like imprisonment. Every suggestion for activities I might enjoy came with a list of reasons why it might not be safe or appropriate for someone in my situation. When I mentioned wanting to take a painting class at the community center, Sarah worried about me driving at night. When I suggested joining a hiking group for seniors, Robert was concerned about my knees and the risk of falling on uneven terrain. When I talked about visiting my sister Helen in Portland, David questioned whether I should be flying alone at my age, navigating airports with all their chaos and confusion. Their concerns weren't malicious. They genuinely believed they were protecting me from harm, preserving my dignity, keeping me safe from a world that had somehow become too dangerous for a 74-year-old woman to navigate independently. But what they didn't understand was that in trying to protect me from every possible risk, they were stealing something far more valuable than safety. They were taking away my sense of purpose, my autonomy, and my belief in my own capabilities. The breaking point came on a Tuesday afternoon in March. I had been browsing travel websites, looking at tours of Morocco and adventures in New Zealand, when Sarah arrived for one of her regular check-ins. She found me with my laptop open to a page featuring the ancient markets of Marrakesh, the screen filled with vibrant images of spices and textiles and bustling street scenes.
Her face immediately shifted into that worried expression I knew so well. "Mom, what are you looking at?" she asked, settling into the chair across from me like a therapist preparing for a difficult session. "Just some travel ideas," I said, trying to keep my voice light. "Helen mentioned she's always wanted to see Morocco, and I thought it might be fun to plan a trip together." Sarah's laugh wasn't cruel, but it was dismissive in a way that stung more than outright mockery would have. "Mom, you can't be serious. Morocco? At your age? The food alone would make you sick, not to mention the language barriers and the different customs. And traveling with Helen? She's 78 and has arthritis in both hands." I felt something tighten in my chest, but I pressed on. "We're not invalids, Sarah. Millions of people our age travel internationally every year. Maybe on cruise ships or organized tours with medical staff, but Morocco isn't like going to Florida, Mom. It's a developing country with different standards of hygiene and healthcare. What if you got sick? What if you had an emergency? What if someone tried to take advantage of two elderly American women?" The phrase elderly American women hit me like a slap. When had I become elderly in my daughter's eyes? When had my decades of competence and independence been erased by a number? "I raised you to be adventurous," I said quietly. "Remember when you were 8 and wanted to climb that huge oak tree in the backyard? Everyone said it was too dangerous, but I helped you figure out how to do it safely."
"You were so proud when you reached the top." Sarah's expression softened slightly, but her resolve didn't waver. "That's different, Mom. I was a kid learning to take appropriate risks. You're at a different stage of life now. There's no shame in accepting that some adventures are behind you." Behind me? As if my life were a book with most of its chapters already written. As if the only pages left were about doctor's appointments and early bird dinners and watching game shows in my living room. That evening, Robert called for his weekly check-in, and Sarah must have told him about our conversation because he immediately launched into his own concerns about my travel ideas. "Mom, I know you're feeling restless since Dad passed, but there are plenty of ways to have adventures right there in Cedar Falls," he said, his voice carrying that careful patience people use when talking to children or patients. "What about joining a book club or taking up gardening? Emma mentioned she could help you start a vegetable garden in the backyard." A vegetable garden. As if growing tomatoes could replace the thrill of watching the sunrise over Angkor Wat, or bargaining in a Turkish bazaar, or standing at the edge of Victoria Falls feeling the mist on my face. "Robert, I appreciate your concern, but I'm not ready to limit myself to hobbies that can be done within a 5-mile radius of my house," I said, trying to keep the frustration out of my voice. "It's not about limiting yourself, it's about being realistic. You're not 25 anymore, Mom. International travel is stressful even for young people. The jet lag, the unfamiliar food, the walking, the crowds, it's just not practical for someone in your situation." Someone in my situation. A 74-year-old widow whose children had decided she was too fragile for the world beyond her front door. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Robert patiently explaining all the reasons why my desire to travel was impractical, unsafe, and, frankly, a bit selfish given how much it would worry the family. By the time I hung up, I felt smaller than I had in years. The next few weeks brought a parade of similar conversations. Emma stopped by with brochures for local senior centers, highlighting activities like bingo nights and craft circles. Lucas sent me links to virtual museum tours I could take from the comfort of my living room. David researched assisted living communities with robust activity programs, just in case I was feeling isolated and needed more social interaction. Everyone had solutions for my restlessness, but none of them involved actually addressing what I was really craving, which was the feeling of being alive, challenged, and capable of handling whatever the world might throw at me. Their suggestions weren't malicious, but they all shared the same underlying assumption, that the woman who had once navigated the London Underground with 3 young children and 2 suitcases, who had talked her way out of a speeding ticket in rural France using broken French and determination, who had organized family reunions for 50 people and fundraising events for hundreds, was now too delicate to book a hotel room in a foreign country. The final straw came during Emma's birthday dinner at Sarah's house. The whole family was there, including David's parents and some family friends, and somehow the conversation turned to travel. One of the guests was describing a recent trip to Thailand, showing photos on her phone and talking about the incredible temples and street food and warm hospitality of the Thai people. "That sounds amazing," I said, genuinely interested. "I've always wanted to visit Southeast Asia. The culture and history must be fascinating." The table went quiet for a moment, and then David's mother, Patricia, spoke up with what I'm sure she intended as helpful advice. "Oh, Margaret, at our age, it's better to enjoy those kinds of places through travel documentaries. Much safer and more comfortable." Patricia was 71, 3 years younger than me, but somehow she had appointed herself as the spokesperson for our collective limitations. "I don't think age should automatically disqualify us from experiencing the world," I said, trying to keep my voice pleasant but firm. Jump immediately jumped in. "Mom, no one's saying age disqualifies you from anything. We're just saying that some destinations are more appropriate for people in their 70s. There are wonderful cruise lines that cater to mature travelers with medical facilities on board and carefully planned excursions. Cruise ships," Robert added, nodding enthusiastically, "perfect for your demographic. Safe, structured, social. You could meet people your own age who share your interests." People my own age who share my interests. As if reaching 74 meant I could only relate to other 74-year-olds. As if my interests had somehow become age-specific rather than simply human. "What if I don't want safe and structured?" I asked, surprising myself with the edge in my voice. "What if I want to figure things out as I go, to be challenged, to have experiences that push me outside my comfort zone?"
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time. So if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
The looks exchanged around that table told me everything I needed to know about how my family viewed such an idea. Emma reached over and patted my hand like I was a confused child having an unreasonable tantrum. "Grandma, we understand that you want excitement, but there are age-appropriate ways to find adventure. Maybe we could plan a family trip somewhere nice and easy, like a resort in Arizona or a long weekend in Branson." Age-appropriate adventure. The phrase made my skin crawl. When had adventure become something that needed to be age-appropriate? When had the fire in my belly been declared incompatible with the number of candles on my birthday cake? That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, feeling more trapped than I had ever felt in my life. My family's love had become a cage, their concern a prison, their protection a slow suffocation of everything that made me who I was. I thought about Paul and how he would have reacted to all this fussing. He'd been the cautious one in our marriage, always reading reviews and planning contingencies, but even he had never tried to talk me out of adventures. He'd supported my solo trip to visit Helen when she was going through her divorce, had encouraged me to take that photography workshop in Santa Fe, even though it meant traveling alone for a week, had been proud when I navigated the chaos of getting our family through European airports during that memorable summer vacation in the 90s. Paul had seen me as capable, resourceful, strong enough to handle whatever challenges I might face. My children, despite being raised by this same capable woman, somehow saw me as fragile, vulnerable, in need of constant protection from a world that had become too dangerous for me to navigate alone. The irony wasn't lost on me. I had raised them to be independent, confident, willing to take calculated risks in pursuit of their dreams. Sarah had moved across the country for college, had traveled solo through Central America during her gap year, had started her own business in her 30s. Robert had relocated to Chicago on the strength of a job offer, had bought and renovated a house in a neighborhood everyone said was too risky, and had made bold financial decisions that paid off handsomely. They were living the kind of adventurous, self-directed lives I had taught them to value, but somehow they believed that same spirit of adventure had an expiration date, that the woman who had modeled courage and independence for them was now too old to embody those qualities herself. Over the following days, I found myself researching not just travel destinations, but the logistics of independent travel for seniors. I discovered online communities of older adults who were living extraordinary lives, taking gap years in their 70s, starting new businesses in their 80s, learning new languages and exploring new cultures well into their 90s. These weren't reckless people throwing caution to the wind. They were thoughtful, prepared, experienced travelers who had simply refused to let their age determine the boundaries of their possible experiences. They researched medical facilities and their destinations, purchased comprehensive travel insurance, planned for contingencies, and then went out and lived full, rich, adventurous lives. Reading their stories, I realized that my family's concerns weren't really about my safety or capabilities. They were about their own fears, their own inability to imagine that a woman in her 70s could successfully navigate challenges they weren't sure they could handle themselves. But I also realized something else. For the past 3 years, I had been complicit in my own diminishment. I had accepted their limitations, had allowed their fears to become my reality, had gradually shrunk my dreams to fit their comfort level rather than expanding their understanding to match my capabilities. The woman who had once driven through a blizzard to get to Robert's college graduation, who had negotiated with contractors and managed household crises and raised confident children, had somehow allowed those same children to convince her that she was too fragile to book a plane ticket. It was time to remind them and myself exactly who Margaret Holbrook really was. But what none of them knew was that their overprotective, supposedly helpless mother had been keeping a secret that would change everything. A secret that would prove once and for all that their fears about my capabilities were not only unfounded, but completely backwards. What happened next would shock them in ways they never saw coming, and teach them a lesson about underestimating the woman who had taught them everything they knew about strength, resilience, and the courage to pursue their dreams. 3 days after that humiliating birthday dinner, I was sitting in my kitchen drinking my morning coffee when the phone rang. The caller ID showed a number I didn't recognize, but something told me to answer it anyway. Mrs. Holbrook? This is Jennifer Walsh from Walsh Financial Services in Des Moines. I'm calling about your investment account with us. Investment account? I frowned, trying to place the name. I'm sorry, but I think you have the wrong number. I don't have any accounts with your firm. Actually, you do, she said gently. It was set up by your late husband, Paul Holbrook, about 15 years ago. He listed you as the sole beneficiary, but requested that we not contact you until 3 years after his passing, per his specific instructions. My hand started shaking so hard I nearly dropped the phone. Paul had set up a secret account? I don't understand. What kind of account? It's a diversified investment portfolio that your husband funded with proceeds from some early tech stock investments he made in the 90s. Apple, Microsoft, Amazon, all purchased when they were still relatively unknown companies. He was quite prescient about the technology sector. I remembered Paul's fascination with computers and the internet, back when most people our age thought it was all too complicated to bother with. He'd spent hours researching companies, reading financial reports, making what seemed like small investments that Sarah and Robert had teased him about at the time. Mrs. Holbrook, are you still there? Yes, I'm here. This is quite a shock. Could you tell me how much is in this account? There was a pause, and then Jennifer's voice came through clearly. The current value is approximately $2.4 million. I dropped the phone. $2.4 million. I sat there staring at my modest kitchen with its 20-year-old appliances and hand-me-down furniture, trying to process what I'd just heard. Paul had left me enough money to do anything I wanted, to go anywhere I dreamed of going, and he'd specifically arranged it so I wouldn't receive it until I'd had time to grieve and figure out who I was without him. When I finally picked up the phone, Jennifer was still waiting patiently. Mrs. Holbrook? I know this is overwhelming. Your husband left a letter for you explaining his reasoning. Would you like me to read it to you? Please, I whispered. He wrote, My dearest Margaret, if you're hearing this, it means I'm gone and you've spent 3 years listening to our children treat you like you're made of porcelain. I set up this account because I knew that after I died, Sarah and Robert would try to wrap you in cotton wool and convince you that your adventuring days were over. This money is my gift to the woman who taught me that life is meant to be lived fully, regardless of what age you happen to be. Use it to remind our children that their mother is the strongest, most capable person they know. Use it to remind yourself. Go see the world, my love. Show them who Margaret Holbrook really is. I was crying so hard I could barely breathe. Paul had known. He'd understood exactly what would happen after he was gone, and he'd planned for it. He'd given me the means to reclaim my life, my independence, my sense of adventure. Mrs. Holbrook, would you like to schedule an appointment to discuss your options? This kind of portfolio gives you tremendous flexibility. You could travel for decades if you wanted to, or purchase property, or start a business. The possibilities are really endless. Yes, I said, my voice stronger than it had been in months. I'd like that very much. The next morning, I drove to Des Moines, something I hadn't done alone in over a year. Sarah would have insisted on accompanying me, worried about me driving on the interstate, concerned about me navigating an unfamiliar city. But I didn't tell Sarah where I was going. For the first time in 3 years, I made a decision about my life without consulting the committee of concerned family members who had appointed themselves as my guardians. Jennifer Walsh turned out to be a woman about Emma's age, professional and warm, who treated me like a competent adult rather than a confused elderly person who might not understand basic concepts about money and investments. Your husband was incredibly smart about his investments, she explained, showing me detailed statements I'd never seen before. He started small in the early 90s, but he had this intuition about which technology companies would succeed. He'd research them obsessively, read everything he could find, and then make careful, strategic investments. I remembered those evenings when Paul would disappear into his study with stacks of financial magazines and annual reports. I thought it was just a hobby, a way for him to feel connected to the business world after his retirement. I had no idea he was building a fortune. The beauty of this portfolio, Jennifer continued, is that it's designed for exactly what you're thinking about. Your husband specifically structured it to provide you with complete financial independence. You could literally travel the world for the rest of your life and never touch the principal. We spent 2 hours going through the details. Paul had been thorough in his planning, setting up trusts and tax-advantaged accounts, making sure I'd have access to funds anywhere in the world, arranging for professional management of the investments so I wouldn't have to worry about market fluctuations or financial planning. What would you recommend for someone who wants to travel extensively? I asked. Jennifer smiled. Honestly, with this kind of financial security, I'd recommend you do whatever makes you happy. You could stay in luxury hotels or backpack through hostels. You could take guided tours or strike out completely on your own. You could buy a home base somewhere exotic or just travel continuously. The money gives you complete freedom to live however you choose. Complete freedom. I hadn't felt truly free in years. On the drive home, I started making mental lists of all the places I'd dreamed of visiting but had dismissed as impractical or too expensive or too complicated for someone in my situation. Morocco, Nepal, Iceland, Japan, New Zealand, Patagonia, the Greek islands, the temples of Cambodia, the markets of Istanbul. For the first time in 3 years, I felt like Margaret Holbrook again. Not Sarah's mother or Robert's responsibility or Emma and Lucas's fragile grandmother, but Margaret, a woman with her own dreams and desires and the means to pursue them. That evening, I sat in Paul's old study and wrote out my plans. Not tentative, maybe someday plans, but concrete, specific, actionable plans. I would start with something dramatic, something that would shatter my family's perception of me as too delicate for independent travel. I booked a trip to Dubai. Not a cautious cruise ship vacation or a guided tour for seniors, but a solo adventure to one of the most dynamic, challenging, culturally complex destinations I could imagine. I researched hotels and booked a suite at the Burj Al Arab, the famous sail-shaped hotel that was supposed to be one of the most luxurious in the world. I arranged for private tours of the city, booked spa treatments, made dinner reservations at restaurants with names I couldn't pronounce. But most importantly, I didn't tell anyone. For 2 weeks, I planned my trip in secret, feeling like a teenager sneaking out of the house. I applied for a passport renewal, bought new luggage, researched customs and cultural expectations, learned basic Arabic phrases. I felt more energized and purposeful than I had since Paul's death. The hardest part was keeping quiet during our regular family interactions. When Sarah stopped by to check on me and found me reading travel guides, I told her I was just indulging in some armchair traveling. When Robert called and asked if I needed help with anything, I assured him everything was fine and I was keeping busy with quiet activities around the house. I hated lying to them, but I also knew that if I told them about my plans, they'd find ways to sabotage them. They'd present me with research about political instability in the Middle East, horror stories about older travelers being taken advantage of, statistics about medical emergencies far from home. They'd wear me down with their concerns until I convinced myself they were right and I was being reckless and foolish. This time, I was going to present them with a fait accompli. I was going to show them, not tell them, exactly what their supposedly fragile mother was capable of. The night before my departure, I finally broke down and told Helen about my plans. My sister had been my confidant since childhood, and I needed someone to know where I was going in case of emergency. "Margaret Holbrook, you magnificent rebel," she said, laughing so hard she nearly choked on her tea. "Paul would be so proud. Dubai. I can't wait to see Sarah's face when she finds out." "You don't think I'm being reckless?" I asked, suddenly needing reassurance that I wasn't making a terrible mistake. "Honey, you navigated raising 2 children, managed a household budget, dealt with Paul's health scares, and kept your family together through decades of challenges. If you can handle all that, you can certainly handle a vacation in a country that caters to wealthy tourists from all over the world." She was right. Dubai wasn't some remote wilderness where I'd be completely cut off from civilization. It was a modern, cosmopolitan city with world-class infrastructure, international hotels, and millions of visitors every year. If anything, I'd probably be safer there than I was driving around Cedar Falls. The morning of my departure, I left a note for Sarah explaining where I'd gone and when I'd be back. I turned off my phone, put it in my carry-on bag, and drove myself to the airport. Walking through the terminal with my new luggage, I felt 20 years younger. Other travelers looked at me with the mild curiosity reserved for older people traveling alone, but I didn't care. I wasn't just another elderly passenger being shepherded through the system by concerned relatives. I was Margaret Holbrook, solo traveler, off to see the world on my own terms. The flight to Dubai was 13 hours with a connection in London, and every minute of it was exhilarating. I'd talked to my seatmate, a businesswoman from Germany who was impressed that I was traveling alone. I navigated the connection in Heathrow without any problems, found my gate, bought souvenirs, and felt completely competent and independent. When the plane touched down in Dubai, I looked out the window at the gleaming skyline and felt something I hadn't experienced in years. Pure, unadulterated excitement about what came next. The hotel exceeded even my high expectations. My suite had floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the Persian Gulf, marble bathrooms, and a balcony where I could watch the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and pink. The staff treated me with respectful attention, never once suggesting that I might need special assistance or accommodation because of my age. That first evening, I had dinner at the hotel's underwater restaurant, surrounded by floor-to-ceiling aquarium walls teeming with colorful fish and graceful rays. I ordered dishes I'd never heard of, tried wine from regions I couldn't locate on a map, and felt more sophisticated and worldly than I had in decades. After dinner, I walked along the beach, my feet in the warm sand, looking up at the Burj Khalifa twinkling against the night sky. I pulled out my phone and turned it on for the first time since leaving Cedar Falls.
37 missed calls, dozens of text messages.
My voicemail was completely full. Sarah had discovered my note. I scrolled through the messages, watching the progression from confusion to concern to panic to anger. Mom, where are you? Call me immediately. Margaret, this isn't funny. We're worried sick. I'm calling the police if you don't respond in the next hour. The police. My daughter had threatened to call the police because her 74-year-old mother had gone on vacation. Instead of calling them back, I did something that would have been unthinkable just a week earlier. I opened the camera on my phone, held it up to capture myself with the Dubai skyline in the background, and took a selfie. Then I posted it to my Facebook account with a simple message. Greetings from Dubai. Having the most wonderful time exploring this incredible city. The world is full of amazing adventures for those brave enough to seek them out. Within minutes, the comments started pouring in. Friends from my church expressing amazement and admiration, former colleagues from Paul's company congratulating me on my adventure, neighbors I hadn't heard from in years sharing their own travel dreams and asking for recommendations. But it was Emma's comment that made me smile the widest. Grandma, you are officially my hero. I can't believe you did this. Tell us everything when you get back. My granddaughter got it. She understood that her grandmother wasn't a fragile old woman who needed protection from the world, but an adventurous spirit who had simply been dormant for a few years. The phone rang almost immediately. Sarah, of course. Mom, what in the world do you think you're doing? Her voice was tight with fear and anger. Dubai? Are you out of your mind? Do you have any idea how worried we've been? I'm having dinner and watching the sunset, I said calmly. It's quite beautiful here. This isn't a joke, Mom. You can't just disappear to the Middle East without telling anyone. What if something happens to you? What if you get sick? What if there's an emergency? Then I'll handle it, I said, surprised by how confident I sounded. The same way I've handled every other challenge in my life. You're 74 years old, traveling alone in a foreign country. This is completely irresponsible. Sarah, I raised you to be independent and adventurous. I supported your gap year in Central America, remember? You were 19 and traveling alone through countries where you didn't speak the language. How is this any different? It's different because you're old, she exploded, and then immediately seemed to realize how that sounded. I mean, you're at a different stage of life. You have different needs, different limitations. The only limitations I have are the ones you've convinced me to accept, and I'm done accepting them. Robert got on the phone next, and then David, and then Emma, all of them talking over each other, expressing concern and confusion, and underneath it all, a grudging admiration that none of them wanted to admit to feeling. Grandma, are you really okay? Emma asked when she finally got the phone to herself. Like, really, truly okay? Not just pretending to be okay? Sweetheart, I'm better than okay. I'm remembering who I used to be before everyone decided I was too fragile to live my own life. Over the next week, I sent postcards and photos from every adventure.
Pictures of me riding a camel in the desert, browsing the spice markets, touring the stunning Sheikh Zayed Mosque, shopping in the luxury malls, eating street food from vendors my family would have been horrified to know I was trusting with my delicate elderly digestive system. Each image was carefully chosen to demonstrate not just that I was surviving my solo adventure, but that I was thriving. I looked healthy, happy, confident, and completely in control of my situation. The response from my family evolved throughout the week. The initial panic gave way to reluctant acceptance, which gradually transformed into something approaching pride. My Facebook posts were getting dozens of likes and comments from people who remembered the adventurous women I used to be and were thrilled to see her reemerge. But it was the phone call from Robert on my 5th day in Dubai that really showed me how much had changed. Mom, he said, his voice different than it had been in years. I owe you an apology. A big one. What do you mean? I mean, we've been treating you like you're incapable, and you're obviously not. You're more capable than most people half your age. I couldn't navigate Dubai by myself. And here you are having the time of your life like it's no big deal. It's not no big deal, I said. It's a very big deal. That's exactly the point. I think Dad would be proud of you. I started crying right there on the beach, not from sadness, but from relief. My son was finally seeing me the way Paul had seen me, the way I'd always seen myself before I let their fears become my reality. Robert, there's something I need to tell you about your father, something I should have told you years ago. I explained about Paul's secret investment account, about the money he'd left me, about the letter that had made it clear he'd expected exactly this kind of reaction from the family. There was a long silence, and then Robert started laughing. Of course Dad knew. He always said you were the strongest person he'd ever met. He used to tell us that if anything happened to him, we should trust you to figure out your own life instead of trying to manage it for you. And did you listen to him? Obviously not. But we're listening now, Mom. We're listening now. On my last night in Dubai, I had dinner at a rooftop restaurant overlooking the fountain show at the Burj Khalifa. As I watched the water dance to music against the backdrop of the world's tallest building, I felt a profound sense of accomplishment. Not just because I'd successfully navigated a complex international trip on my own, but because I'd reclaimed something essential about myself that I'd almost lost forever. I'd remembered that age is just a number, that competence doesn't have an expiration date, and that the spirit of adventure that had defined so much of my younger life was still alive and well, just waiting for me to set it free. I raised my glass of champagne to the Dubai skyline and made a toast to Paul, wherever he was, for knowing exactly what I would need and when I would need it. Thank you, my love, for seeing who I really am, even when I forgot it myself. Tomorrow, I would fly home to Cedar Falls, but I wouldn't be the same woman who had left a week ago. I was returning as Margaret Holbrook, world traveler, financial independent, and living proof that the best adventures in life don't end at 70. They're just getting started. The flight home from Dubai felt different than the journey out. I wasn't the same woman who had nervously checked her luggage a week ago, worried about whether she was making a terrible mistake. I was returning as someone who had proven to herself and her family that age didn't define capability, that independence wasn't something you lost when you reached a certain number of birthdays. But I also knew that the real test wasn't surviving a week in Dubai. The real challenge would be maintaining this newfound sense of self when I was back in Cedar Falls, surrounded by the same family dynamics that had nearly convinced me I was too fragile to manage my own life. Sarah was waiting for me at the airport, looking like she hadn't slept properly in days. When she saw me walking through the terminal, pulling my luggage behind me with confident strides, her expression went through a complex series of emotions: relief, residual anger, confusion, and something that might have been admiration. "Mom," she said, rushing toward me, "are you okay? Really okay? You look—" She paused, studying my face as if trying to identify what had changed. "You look different." I felt different. A week of navigating a foreign city, making decisions for myself, proving my competence at every turn, had reminded me who Margaret Holbrook really was underneath all those layers of protective concern my family had wrapped around me. "I look like myself again," I said, giving her a hug. "The real me, not the fragile version you've all been so worried about." The drive home was filled with her questions, each one revealing how little she'd understood about my capabilities.
She was amazed that I'd navigated the Dubai airport alone, that I'd figured out the currency and tipping customs, that I'd eaten street food without getting sick, that I'd managed to communicate effectively despite not speaking Arabic. "But how did you know what to do?" she kept asking. "How did you figure out the transportation? How did you find the right restaurants? How did you know which areas were safe?" Each question reminded me of something I'd forgotten during those 3 years of being treated like I needed constant guidance. I was intelligent, resourceful, and experienced. I'd spent decades solving problems, making decisions, adapting to new situations. None of those skills had disappeared when Paul died or when I turned 70. "Sarah, I raised 2 children, managed a household, dealt with emergencies and challenges for decades. Dubai was actually easier than most of the problems I've solved in my life. At least there, people treated me like a competent adult. She was quiet for a long moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was different. We've been treating you like you couldn't take care of yourself, haven't we? Yes, you have. And I let you, because I was grieving and lonely, and it felt easier to accept your limitations than to fight for my independence. But that version of me wasn't real, Sarah. It was just grief and fear dressed up as old age. That evening, Robert called from Chicago, and for the first time in years, our conversation wasn't about whether I was taking my medications or eating properly or remembering to lock my doors. He wanted to hear about my adventures, about what I'd learned, about how it felt to be traveling solo at 74. Mom, I've been thinking a lot since you left, he said, about Dad, about the things he used to say about you, about how we've been acting since he died. What kinds of things did he say? He used to tell me that if anything ever happened to him, I should remember that you were the strongest person in our family. He said you'd raised us to be independent, and we should trust you to live independently too. He was worried that we'd try to take over your life out of some misguided sense of protection. Paul had known his children well. He'd understood that their love for me would manifest as a desire to shield me from every possible risk, even if that protection came at the cost of my autonomy and sense of self. He was right to be worried, I said gently, but I don't blame you for caring about me. I just needed you to care about me as Margaret, not as a problem to be managed. I get that now. And Mom, I'm proud of you. What you did took real courage. I don't know if I would have had the guts to take off for Dubai by myself. Over the following days, word of my solo adventure spread through our small community in ways I hadn't expected. My neighbor Martha was impressed, but not surprised, reminding me that she'd always known I had more fight in me than I'd been showing lately. My former colleagues from the library, where I'd volunteered, were asking for travel recommendations, inspired by my example to consider their own delayed dreams. But the most meaningful reaction came from Emma, who showed up at my door 3 days after I returned home, carrying a stack of travel brochures and a notebook filled with her own adventure plans. "Grandma, I need to tell you something," she said, settling into my living room with the same determined expression I recognized from looking in mirrors. "Your Dubai trip changed something for me, too." "What do you mean?" "I've been playing it safe my whole life, choosing the practical major, taking the stable job, dating the nice but boring guy my parents approve of. I realized I learned that from watching how everyone treated you after Grandpa died. The message was that getting older meant giving up on dreams, playing it safe, accepting limitations." She opened one of her travel brochures, revealing glossy photos of mountain peaks and ancient temples. "But seeing you in those photos, seeing how alive and happy you looked, I realized that's not what getting older has to mean. If you can have adventures at 74, I can certainly have them at 23. Emma had been accepted to a teaching program in South Korea, something she'd applied for months earlier, but had been too scared to seriously consider. My trip to Dubai had somehow given her permission to take her own leap of faith. "I'm going, Grandma. I'm going to teach English in Seoul for a year, maybe longer. And when I come back, I want to hear all about your next adventure." My next adventure. The phrase sent a thrill through me that I hadn't expected. I'd been so focused on proving I could handle one international trip that I hadn't really considered how that success might open up a whole world of possibilities. That evening, I sat in Paul's old study with my laptop, not researching local senior center activities or age-appropriate hobbies, but planning my next journey.
I had nearly $2.5 million at my disposal and a renewed sense of my own capabilities. The world was quite literally my oyster. I made a list of all the places I'd dreamed of visiting but had dismissed as impractical or too challenging. Morocco, where I could explore ancient Medinas and ride camels across desert dunes. Iceland, where I could witness the northern lights and soak in natural hot springs. Nepal, where I could trek through mountain villages and experience Buddhist culture firsthand. Japan,
where I could navigate the complexity of an entirely different culture and writing system. Each destination represented not just a travel goal, but a challenge to the narrative that had nearly defined my later years. If I could handle the cultural complexity of Dubai, I could certainly navigate the language barriers in Tokyo. If I could manage 13-hour flights and jet lag, I could handle the physical demands of trekking in Nepal. But I also realized that the real victory wasn't just about proving I could travel internationally. It was about reclaiming my right to make decisions about my own life, to take calculated risks, to pursue experiences that brought me joy and fulfillment, regardless of what other people thought was appropriate for my age. The next Sunday, I hosted family dinner for the first time since my trip. But instead of spending the day in the kitchen preparing everyone else's favorite dishes, I ordered catering from a Middle Eastern restaurant in Des Moines and decorated the dining room with photos from my Dubai adventure. When Sarah, David, Robert, Emma, and Lucas arrived, they found a celebration of independence rather than the quiet family obligation these dinners had become. "Mom, this is amazing," Robert said, examining the photos I displayed around the room. "You really did all this stuff yourself?" "Of course I did. Just like I managed to raise you and your sister, run a household, and handle every other challenge life threw at me for 7 decades." David, who had been one of the most vocal concerns about my desire to travel, was studying a photo of me at the top of the Burj Khalifa observation deck. "Margaret, I owe you an apology. We've been treating you like you couldn't handle normal life activities when you're obviously capable of handling things most people wouldn't even attempt." "I appreciate that, David. But I want you to understand something important. This isn't about proving I'm some kind of superhuman senior citizen. It's about refusing to accept limitations that aren't based on reality." Sarah set down her plate and looked at me seriously. "Mom, we need to talk about what happens next. I mean, are you planning more trips like this? Because if you are, we need to figure out how to support you instead of trying to stop you." "I am planning more trips, many more. Paul left me with the resources to travel for the rest of my life if I choose to, and I intend to use them." I explained about the investment account, about Paul's letter, about his understanding that they would try to limit my adventures out of concern for my safety. I watched their faces change as they realized their father had predicted their behavior and planned accordingly. "He knew we'd do this?" Sarah asked, looking embarrassed. "He knew you'd love me so much that you'd try to protect me from every possible risk, even if that protection ended up limiting my life in ways he wouldn't have wanted." Emma leaned forward, her eyes bright with interest. "So what's next, Grandma? Where are you going?" I pulled out a world map I'd printed from the internet, marked with red pens indicating my planned destinations over the next 2 years. Morocco in the spring, Iceland in the summer, Nepal in the fall, Japan in the winter. Each trip carefully researched and planned, but not cautiously limited by other people's fears about what I could handle. "These are just the definite plans," I said. "After that, I'm thinking about spending a few months in different countries. Maybe renting apartments and living like a local rather than just being a tourist." Lucas, who had been quiet throughout dinner, suddenly spoke up. "Grandma, can I ask you something? Aren't you scared? I mean, traveling alone to all these places where you don't know anyone?" It was a fair question, one I'd been asking myself as I planned these more ambitious adventures. "Of course I'm scared sometimes," I said honestly. "But I'm more scared of spending the rest of my life wondering what I might have experienced if I'd been braver." Fear is information, not instruction. It tells me to be prepared and careful, not to stay home and safe.
The conversation that followed was unlike any family discussion we'd had in years. Instead of everyone tiptoeing around my supposed fragility, we talked openly about travel challenges, safety precautions, emergency planning, and the practical aspects of extended international travel. Robert surprised me by offering to help research travel insurance options and international banking arrangements. Sarah, still clearly worried but trying to be supportive, wanted to know about communication plans and emergency contacts.
Even David started asking questions about the logistics of extended travel, admitting he'd always dreamed of taking a sabbatical to explore Europe, but had never felt he could justify the time away from work.
You know what the real revelation is? Sarah said as we cleared the dinner dishes. We've been so focused on protecting you from imaginary dangers that we forgot you've always been the one who taught us how to handle real ones. What do you mean? When I was 8 and fell off my bike, you didn't bubble wrap me and forbid me from riding again. You cleaned up my scraped knees, helped me figure out what went wrong, and sent me back out to practice until I felt confident again. When Robert was struggling in college, you didn't solve his problems for him. You listened, offered advice, and trusted him to find his own solutions. She was right. I'd raised them to be resilient, independent, capable of handling challenges and recovering from setbacks. But after Paul died, they'd somehow forgotten that the woman who had taught them those skills still possessed them herself. We reversed the roles without realizing it, Robert added. We started treating you like the child and ourselves like the responsible adults, when you're the one with decades more experience handling difficult situations. The months that followed were a revelation for all of us. Instead of weekly check-ins focused on my health and safety, our conversations became travel planning sessions. Sarah researched accommodations and local customs. Robert investigated international communication options and financial logistics. Emma sent me language learning apps and cultural guides. They were still concerned about my safety, but their concern had transformed from paralyzing fear into practical support. They helped me prepare for challenges rather than trying to talk me out of facing them. My trip to Morocco in April was even more successful than Dubai had been, partly because I was more confident in my abilities, but also because my family's support gave me additional security and peace of mind. When I called them from the markets of Marrakesh, their questions were about what I was experiencing and learning, not whether I was managing to survive the day. I spent 3 weeks exploring ancient cities, learning to navigate the complex social customs, bargaining with merchants, trying foods I'd never heard of, and generally having the kind of immersive cultural experience I'd dreamed about for decades. The photos I shared on social media generated hundreds of comments from friends and acquaintances who were inspired by my example. Several other women in their 70s reached out to ask about my travel planning process, admitting they'd been considering their own solo adventures, but had been discouraged by family members or their own assumptions about age-appropriate activities. I started an informal mentoring relationship with a few of these women, sharing practical advice about international travel for older adults, but more importantly, encouraging them to trust their own capabilities and refuse to accept limitations based solely on their age. By the time I returned from Iceland that summer, where I'd hiked glaciers and swum in geothermal pools and photographed the northern lights, my transformation was complete. Not just my own transformation, but my family's understanding of who I really was. The woman they'd been trying to protect for 3 years had revealed herself to be stronger, more adventurous, and more capable than any of them had realized. I wasn't just surviving my solo travels, I was thriving in ways that were inspiring other people to reconsider their own assumptions about aging and adventure. On my 75th birthday, instead of a quiet family dinner focused on how grateful we should all be that I was healthy and safe, we had a celebration of everything I'd accomplished and experienced in the past year. The dining room walls were covered with photos from 4 different countries, postcards from a dozen cities, and a map showing all the places I planned to visit in the coming year. "Mom," Sarah said, raising her glass in a toast, "a year ago, we thought we were protecting you by trying to keep you close to home and safe from adventure. We realize now that we were actually protecting ourselves from facing the truth about what you're capable of." "And what truth is that?" I asked. "That you're the bravest, most capable person we know. That age hasn't diminished your abilities or your right to live exactly the life you choose. And that we're incredibly lucky to have a mother who's showing us what it means to never give up on dreams, no matter what age you happen to be." Robert nodded, adding his own thoughts.
Dad knew exactly what he was doing when he set up that account and wrote that letter. He knew you'd need the resources to prove to us, and maybe to yourself, that Margaret Holbrook wasn't done living her fullest life. As I looked around the table at my family, I felt a deep satisfaction that had nothing to do with the stamps in my passport or the countries I'd visited. I'd reclaimed something essential about myself, but more importantly, I'd taught my children a lesson about respecting the people they love enough to let them live their own lives, take their own risks, and pursue their own dreams. Emma, who had just returned from her first semester teaching in Seoul, leaned over to whisper in my ear, "Grandma, when I grow up, I want to be just like you, brave enough to bet on myself no matter what anyone else thinks." That night, as I sat in my living room planning my next adventure to Nepal, I thought about Paul and the incredible gift he had given me. Not just the money to travel, though that had been transformative, but the understanding that I deserved to live my life on my own terms, with the support and respect of the people who loved me. At 75, I was just getting started. I had decades of adventures ahead of me, and a family who had finally learned that the best way to love someone isn't to limit their possibilities, but to celebrate their courage to explore them. The woman who had once been told she couldn't travel alone at her age was now planning to spend her next birthday watching the sunrise over Mount Everest Base Camp. And my family, instead of trying to talk me out of it, was helping me plan the logistics and cheering me on. Sometimes, the greatest gift you can give the people you love is refusing to become smaller to make them feel more comfortable. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is insist on remaining exactly who you are, dreams and adventures and all, regardless of what the calendar says about your age. Paul understood that. Now, finally, so did the rest of my family. And as for me, I understood that the best chapters of my life weren't behind me. They were waiting for me in mountain villages and ancient temples, in foreign markets and distant shores, in every adventure brave enough to pursue, and every dream courageous enough to claim.
The world was wide, my passport was ready, and Margaret Holbrook was just getting started. 6 months after my 75th birthday celebration, I was packing for Nepal when Helen called with news that would change everything once again. My sister, now 78 and dealing with her own family's concerns about her independence, had been following my adventures with a mixture of admiration and longing. "Margaret, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me," she said, her voice carrying a determination I hadn't heard in years. "Do you think I'm too old to join you on one of these trips?" I nearly dropped the hiking boots I'd been stuffing into my suitcase. Helen had been talking about travel for decades, but her arthritis had worsened over the past few years, and her daughter Patricia had been even more protective than my own children had been. "Helen, what brought this on?" "Seeing your photos from Iceland, reading about your experiences, watching how different you look in every picture you post. I realized I've been letting Patricia convince me that my traveling days are over, just like your kids tried to convince you. But watching you prove them wrong has made me wonder what I might be capable of if I stopped listening to everyone else's fears." The conversation that followed lasted 2 hours. Helen had been researching travel options for seniors with mobility limitations, had consulted with her doctor about international travel, and had even started taking physical therapy to strengthen her hands and improve her stamina. She wasn't asking to trek through the Himalayas, but she was interested in a gentler adventure, something that would prove to herself and her daughter that being 78 with arthritis didn't mean her exploring days were finished. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "I keep looking at those river cruises through Europe, the ones where you can get on and off at different cities, but you're not dealing with airports and packing and unpacking every few days. Patricia thinks even that's too ambitious, but I think she's wrong." She was right. A European river cruise would be perfect for someone with Helen's physical limitations, offering cultural immersion and adventure within a framework that accommodated mobility concerns.
It was exactly the kind of compromise between safety and adventure that could work for older travelers who weren't ready to give up on experiences entirely. Helen, I think it's a wonderful idea. And if you're serious about it, I'd love to help you plan it. You would? Even though it's not as exciting as your solo adventures? Are you kidding? Helping my sister reclaim her sense of adventure would be more exciting than any solo trip I could take. Over the following weeks, I postponed my Nepal trip and threw myself into helping Helen plan her European river cruise. It was a completely different kind of travel planning than I'd been doing for my own adventures, requiring research into wheelchair accessibility, medical facilities along the route, and accommodations for travelers with physical limitations. But it was also incredibly rewarding. I was using the confidence and research skills I developed through my own travels to help someone else break free from the limiting assumptions that had been placed on her. Helen and I spent hours on video calls, comparing cruise lines, examining itineraries, and discussing practical concerns like medication management and emergency procedures. The most challenging part wasn't the logistics. It was dealing with Patricia's resistance. Helen's daughter was convinced that her mother was being reckless, that international travel was inappropriate for someone with her health conditions, that she was putting herself at unnecessary risk by leaving the familiar environment of her assisted living community in Portland. "Margaret, I need you to talk sense into my mother," Patricia said when she called me directly. "She's 78 years old with arthritis, balance issues, and a heart condition. She has no business gallivanting around Europe like some kind of college student on spring break." I recognized the fear in Patricia's voice because I'd heard the same tone from my own children just a year earlier. The desperate need to protect a parent from perceived dangers, even if that protection came at the cost of their joy and sense of purpose. "Patricia, your mother isn't planning to backpack through hostels. She's considering a luxury cruise specifically designed for older travelers, with medical facilities on board and professional staff trained to assist passengers with mobility limitations." "But what if something happens? What if she falls? What if she gets sick? What if there's an emergency and I can't get to her? What if she spends the rest of her life regretting the adventure she didn't take because everyone was too afraid to let her try?" The question hung in the air for a long moment, and when Patricia spoke again, her voice was different. "Is that what you think we were doing to you? Taking away your adventures because we were too afraid? I think you were loving me the best way you knew how, just like you're loving Helen the best way you know how. But sometimes the most loving thing we can do is trust the people we care about to make their own decisions about the risks they're willing to take." Patricia was quiet for so long I thought she had hung up. Then she sighed deeply. "Mom seems happier planning this trip than she's been in months. Even if I think it's a terrible idea, I can't deny that having something to look forward to has given her more energy than she's had since Dad died. That's because having dreams and goals gives us purpose, regardless of our age. Your mother isn't ready to stop living her life just because other people think she should." The breakthrough came when Helen invited Patricia to help with the planning process, rather than simply fighting against it. Instead of trying to talk her mother out of traveling, Patricia began researching travel insurance options, investigating the cruise line's safety record, and even considering joining Helen for part of the trip.
If she's determined to do this crazy thing, at least I can help make sure she's prepared for it, Patricia told me during one of our planning calls. And honestly, some of those ports look pretty interesting. Maybe I could meet her in Amsterdam and spend a few days with her before she continues on to Germany. Helen was thrilled at the possibility of having her daughter join her, even briefly. It transformed the trip from something Patricia was fighting against into something she was actively supporting, even if she was still worried about the logistics and potential risks. The day Helen left for Europe, I drove to the airport to see her off. At 78, using a walking cane and moving more slowly than she would have liked, she was still radiant with excitement and determination. "Margaret, I can't thank you enough for encouraging me to do this," she said as we waited for her boarding announcement. I was starting to believe that my age meant my adventures were over, that I should be content with staying safe and comfortable. Age doesn't disqualify us from adventure, Helen. It just means we have to be more creative about how we pursue it. Over the following 2 weeks, I followed Helen's journey through her daily emails and photos. She navigated the airport successfully, settled into her river cruise with enthusiasm, and began experiencing Europe in ways she dreamed about for decades. Her messages were filled with wonder and pride. She described the medieval castles along the Rhine, the charming villages in the Netherlands, the incredible museums and cathedrals she'd visited during port stops. But more importantly, she wrote about feeling capable, independent, and fully alive in ways she hadn't experienced since her husband's death. "I'm not the same person who got on this boat 2 weeks ago," she wrote from Vienna. "I'm remembering who I used to be before everyone convinced me I was too fragile for the world. Thank you for showing me that it was never too late to reclaim that person." The photos she sent showed a woman transformed. Helen looked confident, happy, and fully engaged with her experiences. She was using her walking cane, moving carefully, taking appropriate precautions for her physical limitations, but she was also clearly thriving in ways that staying safe at home could never have provided. When Patricia joined Helen in Amsterdam for the final few days of the trip, the pictures showed both women laughing and exploring together. Patricia later told me that seeing her mother navigate foreign cities, communicate with locals, and handle travel challenges with grace had completely changed her understanding of what her mother was capable of. "I've been treating Mom like she was fragile and incapable, when she's actually just older and more experienced," Patricia admitted. "She handled problems on this trip that would have frustrated people half her age, and she did it with patience and creativity I'd forgotten she possessed." Helen's successful European adventure had ripple effects throughout our extended family and friend network. Her assisted living community was buzzing with interest from other residents who had been inspired by her example to reconsider their own travel dreams. Several of her neighbors began researching cruises and guided tours designed for seniors with various physical limitations. But the most significant impact was on my own understanding of what it meant to age with dignity and purpose. Helping Helen reclaim her sense of adventure had been just as fulfilling as my own solo travels, maybe more so, because it involved sharing the joy of discovery with someone I loved. When I finally left for Nepal 3 months later, I carried with me a deeper appreciation for the different ways people could pursue adventure and independence as they aged. Not everyone could or wanted to trek through mountain villages alone, but that didn't mean they had to give up on meaningful experiences or cultural exploration. My trek to Everest Base Camp was everything I'd hoped it would be: physically challenging, but manageable, culturally enriching, and spiritually profound. But the experience was enhanced by knowing that Helen was back in Portland planning her next adventure with Patricia's support and encouragement. The woman who had once been told she was too old and fragile for international travel was now researching a photography tour of Ireland, something that would combine her love of gardening with her newfound confidence in navigating foreign countries. "Age is just information," Helen told me during one of our post-trip phone calls. "It tells us to be prepared and careful, but it doesn't tell us to stop living or stop dreaming or stop believing in our own capabilities." She was echoing something I'd learned through my own journey, but hearing her say it after watching her prove it to herself and her family made the truth even more powerful. As I planned my next series of adventures, I realized that my travel experiences had evolved beyond personal fulfillment into something resembling a mission. I was no longer just proving to my own family that age didn't disqualify me from adventure. I was demonstrating to an entire community of older adults that the stories we tell ourselves about aging and limitation are often more restrictive than reality requires. My social media posts about travel were generating messages from women and men in their 60s, 70s, and 80s who had been inspired to reconsider their own assumptions about what was possible at their age. Some were planning their own solo adventures, others were researching group travel options, and many were simply refusing to accept their family's limitations on their independence and decision-making. The transformation wasn't just individual, it was generational. Adult children who had been treating their parents as fragile and incapable were beginning to recognize that their protective instincts might actually be limiting the people they loved most. Emma, who had returned from Seoul with her own enhanced sense of adventure and independence, put it perfectly during our latest family dinner. "Grandma,
You didn't just change your own life when you got on that boat to Dubai. You changed how our whole family thinks about aging, about capability, about the relationship between love and control. You showed us that supporting someone doesn't mean limiting them. At 75, I discovered that the most meaningful adventures weren't necessarily the ones I took alone, but the ones that inspired other people to reclaim their own sense of possibility. The woman who had once been told she couldn't travel alone at her age was now encouraging others to question the limitations they'd accepted, to trust their own capabilities, and to refuse to let other people's fears define their reality. The world was still wide, my passport was still ready, and Margaret Holbrook was still just getting started. But now I was traveling not just for my own fulfillment, but as living proof that the best chapters of life don't end at 70. They just require more courage to write. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.